Hi, Dr. Tronél Hellberg here from G-sential theory of music. In today's video, I'm going to look at another aspect of music practical performance assessment, and that is how do we go about assessing sight reading, technical work, and oral. Now, let me quickly share my screen with you. So, this video is mainly aimed at teachers who are teaching in South African schools. So that can be either government schools or private schools that are specifically using the IEB syllabus. And of course, the government schools use CAPS as curriculum in the schools. Now, I'm going to quickly just share a couple of similarities and differences between the two syllabi, because if you're a teacher, this year you might be teaching at a government school and next year at a private school. So it's worth knowing something about both of them. Okay, now let's quickly just look at the exit levels. So in grade 10, it's a grade 2 level. So in other words, Royal Schools, ABRS in Trinity College London. And then by the end, when they reach grade 12, the learners must be at the grade 5 exit level. Having said this, the pieces in the final exam that learners need to sight read will never be at, so say it's a grade 5, it would not be a grade 5 piece. The likelihood is that it would rather be a grade 4 or a grade 3 level that they need to play. Okay, now the next thing is when learners offer more than one instrument in a government school, they can decide whether they want to play their sight reading on the one or the other instrument. But when it gets to IEB, they have to do the sight reading on their main instrument. Then another important difference is in the final exam, in your government schools, learners are not allowed to physically play the sight reading piece. So they can just quietly try it out, but without any without making any sounds. Sorry, without making any sounds. Whereas in your IEB schools, at least learners can try it out and they can just play it. Okay. Then your CAP syllabus states that it's unaccompanied reading of at least 12 bars. It is normally 12 bars, and it's not specified in IEB, but because IEB is based on CAPS, it's the same. Okay, then lastly, there isn't a rubric in the actual CAPS document for sight reading. But if you look at the grade 12 exam guidelines, you will find a rubric there, which you can also use for grade 10 and 11. And looking at IEB, there is a rubric for sight reading in the SAGS document. Okay, so I'm going to look now at the assessment of sight reading. Now, it's very useful to use a rubric. And, chances are that the school where you're teaching will have a set rubric for an exam. And I mean, you know it by now, but a rubric really helps examiners to be consistent and ensure that the assessment is reliable. Now, I really like this rubric from the IEB SAGS document. And it's got 7 levels. So 7 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. The total mark for sight reading is 10. And if a learner achieves level 7, it means that they played fluently and persuasively. They were alert to details of phrasing and articulation and good attention to dynamics, and they even demonstrated that they played it musically. So not many learners will get that right. Sight reading is really one of those elements most learners struggle with in the exam. Okay, so if they got that right, or that's the level of playing, you're looking at a percentage of between 80 and 100. So I'm not going to go through all these descriptors, but it's a very nice rubric to have. Then just on the sideline there, I would like to give you a hint or a tip rather. When you do practical assessments, it's good to have rubrics from Royal School, Trinity, Rock School, just next to you. Sometimes we run out of ideas when we comment, and you'll just see a comment and you'll know, yes, this fits this learner's performance quite well. Okay, so well, that's what I normally did, and your comments then just look a bit more professional. Okay, so if you want to look at Royal Schools, their document that's got the the rubrics is called Your Guide to ABRS in Music Exams. And then Rock School, you can have a look at their digital mark sheet. And then Trinity College London, it's included in each of the various instrument syllabuses. Okay, now I'm going to just quickly give you a couple of tips when it gets to the actual assessment of sight reading. Now, first of all, like I said, remember it's one of those components most learners struggle with. You can't compare the pieces that they've practiced for a couple of months with, a 12-bar melody that they're playing, that they had 1 minute to prepare for. So you need to just keep that in mind. And you need to focus on the overall impression of their playing. So when they make a mistake, you need to think, okay, how serious is this mistake? Is it, and also think of the severity of the mistake. Was it like really a big disaster, or was it really just a small mistake? So always keep your focus on the bigger picture. Then you don't need to penalize for every single mistake. Remember, if the total is 10 marks and the learner made one pitch error, are you going, and the rest of the performance was fine, we looked at these descriptors, it was fluent, it was musical, the phrasing was there, they literally made one mistake. So you need to ask yourself, am I going to penalize them with 1 mark or half a mark? Half a mark is 5%. Okay, so can you see, you need to think about this, because how are you going to assess it then if they really mess the whole piece up? Okay, and then another tip that I want to share with you, in order to make sure you stay objective. Say, for example, okay, so it's 12 bars and the learner played the first 6 bars really perfectly well. Maybe they made 1 or 2 small errors. But then they got to the second half and they made a complete mess out of it. They got the key signature wrong. There's a lot of pitch errors. Rhythm is wrong. Whatever. It's just a complete disaster. Maybe they don't even finish it. So what I would suggest in, so first of all, remember the first half was sort of okay. So split it. Think, okay, first half, 5 marks. How many marks am I going to award here? I would think it's going to be between 3 and 4 marks. because chances are they didn't look at the dynamics or the phrasing. If they did, definitely 4 marks. If there were really nothing that bothered you, you can even give 5 marks there. Okay, now you get to the second part and you think, okay, severity. How bad was this really? And then you award a mark for that and obviously add the two together. So just be careful, especially if it ends badly, that doesn't distract you from the rest of the performance. Okay, now let's talk about the elements of pitch, rhythm, and flow. So I would say if these elements were there, everything was accurate, there was a good flow, the rhythm was fine, you can give, say, 8 out of 10. If there were small mistakes, you can give 7 marks, or maybe even 7.5. If everything was really fine, the pitch was there, the rhythm, the flow, dynamics, they actually did a musical performance. And there was literally nothing that bothered you. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't award full marks. Remember, you can award full marks. Good. Then let's talk about the dynamics. So say, for example, they weren't, so the dynamics are, is in the piece, it's indicated, but the learner doesn't really pay much attention to the dynamics, but it was very musical. How are you going to penalize that? Okay, because I personally think if it's a musical performance, that's more important to me. But okay, so maybe you can then subtract half a mark or even 1 mark. Just remember, bigger picture. Okay, so 1 mark would actually be 10%. Okay, so I would actually just subtract then half a mark. Then say, for example, that everything is perfect. The only element, so the rhythm was fine, the pitches were fine, but they didn't include any dynamic changes. It wasn't musical. So same thing, I would then say subtract either half or maybe 1 mark for that. Another thing that that I would like to mention is that it's very easy to mark your good performances, but it gets more tricky when it gets to the bad ones. So say, for example, the pitches were generally correct, but the rhythm was really poor and there was absolutely no attempt in terms of the dynamics. How are you going to mark that? And there's always this debate when it gets to sight reading. Are the pitches more important, like accurate pitches, or rhythm? And I think, again, think bigger picture. In an orchestral performance, in a solo performance, well, especially ensemble performance, what is going to make the biggest or what's going to distract you the most? Is it going to be pitch? Is it going to be rhythm? Well, I think it's both. But rhythm, if you can't, if it's 4/4 and you have 4 crotchets and then sounds like 4 quavers, if that's in an ensemble, you're really going to mess up the whole ensemble. So I have to say I do mark rhythm or rhythmic accuracy more strictly. Good. So I would say think in terms of awarding. So if you take your 10 marks, you can say, okay, let's award 3 marks for rhythm and 1 mark for flow. And then for pitch, 3 marks, and dynamics, articulation, and phrasing, 2 marks, tempo 1 mark. I'm not too concerned if they play it a bit slow. If it's a lot slower, obviously you're going to penalize. Okay, but bigger picture again, remember, if you subtract 1 mark, it's 10%. When it gets to restarts, people feel different about it because you might argue that, you know, one learner played it once, they made a couple of mistakes, and then the second learner also played it, made a couple of mistakes, they restarted, and that performance was fine. So which one are you going to mark? Is it fair towards the other candidates? I think generally, when they restart, restarts are normally worse. You should know this. So I don't penalize them if they start over. Maybe if they start over the 3rd time, you can think of penalizing them. Good. And then, yeah, and when you penalize them, I would say between 0.5 mark and 1 mark. Okay, so that means between 5 and 10% of their marks. Then you also need to consider the specific instrument. So if you look at your string players and your vocalists, intonation is important, okay? Percussion, rhythm, and beat is important. So with a piano, for example, there's no problem with intonation. And so you need to look at the piano as instrument, you know, and the synchronicity of the hands, for example. And there's a great study by Rubric. He did a PhD in how to assess music practical performance in terms of the various instruments. And I could strongly recommend Googling it, downloading it, and having a look at it. It's really worthwhile thinking of different instruments, things that are difficult to them, and how you should assess that versus other instruments that don't have the same challenge. And then lastly, remember, focus on consistency. Think of what you gave the previous learner for his or her sight reading 5 learners ago. You can even afterwards look at all your marks and think of the performances and ask yourself, was I consistent across the board? So yes, that is basically, and I see I never stopped sharing my screen, but nonetheless, that's just a couple of tips when it gets to assessing sight reading. Okay, now let's have a look at the assessment of technical work. And then again, I'm going to share my screen. I'll try and remember to stop sharing when I'm done with it, if I talk afterwards. Okay, so let's have a look at it. So again, let's quickly compare our CAP syllabus to our IEB SACs. So first of all, your learners that offer more than one instrument can decide on which instrument they want to present their technical work. When it gets to IEB, again, they need to do it on the main instrument. Then with your IEB schools, learners must perform their technical work at the level of the majority of their pieces. So if it's, say, grade 5, then it needs to be grade 5 level. It's unspecified in caps. And then also, if a learner presents technical work at a higher level than required, the marks are adjusted according to a table which is provided in SACs. And I think that's a very nice incentive actually for learners to perform at a higher grade. Then again, there's a rubric for the assessment of technical work in your grade 12 exam guidelines, but there is a rubric in the SAGS document. Good, so let's quickly talk about marking scales and arpeggios. Now, first of all, what I would suggest is, look, we're all specialists in a specific instrument. So speak to different instrumentalists, other teachers, and ask them when it gets to the scales. Let them have a look at the list of scales and tell you which scales are easy, which ones are difficult, which ones are in between. It will just help you to ask a balanced selection of scales. Of course, if you're familiar with the instrument, you don't need to do that. Then when it gets to the marking strategy, this is what I would suggest. Remember, again, you can't penalize for every single mistake. It's going to mean the learner isn't going to get a lot of marks. And you're looking at 2 marks per scale. So what I would suggest is that you think of it in terms of your ascending scale and your descending scale. And then say half of the ascending and half, half, and then half for the descending scale. So normally they might make, one little mistake. Maybe it's a rhythm mistake, maybe it's a pitch mistake, maybe they just stumble or become a bit hesitant at a point. So then you would subtract half a mark there. Then if the scale is too slow overall, or the tempo fluctuates the whole time, okay, so if it's slow overall, I would subtract half a mark. If it's like really, really slow, I might subtract, 1 mark, okay? But then again, you might have to think of, after the learner played all the scales, think of penalizing overall for too slow playing or bad intonation or tonguing. Okay, so you can think of that as well. But normally, I would suggest just do it per scale. I've never actually done it where I subtract overall for all the scales. Good, and then if there's a learner who play a scale and then they realize they played the wrong scale, or they made a couple of errors and they ask you to restart, again, it's fine. Let them restart. I won't penalize them for that, but if they're going to restart the whole time, like every single scale, I would then actually penalize overall. You can even, like per scale, then subtract half a mark, but I wouldn't subtract more than that, because half a mark is out of 2 is literally 25%. Okay, so is it really fair to penalize them with 25% because they restarted? So I don't think so. Good, and then just one last thing before we look at the rubric is, I would suggest, or not suggest, I want to encourage you actually, since you're working with half marks, you're only going to round up or down at the end of your technical work section, and then or if you work in quarter marks, because you also get, let me quickly just add this, you get people who split the scale into 4. So if we look at this diagram, it would be quarter marks. And it's interesting, if you mark with someone like that, in the end it seems to even out between examiners. But that's another option. And you can have the system where you, every time that you hear something that's wrong, you just make a dot. You make a dot, you make a dot, you make a dot. And then, so the dots are quarter marks. And then you add that up. Okay, so after you've completed your scale section, then you can round up or down, but keep the half mark. So if the learner got 7.5 for scales, just leave it like that, and then you round it up or down. Well, it would be up at the end of the exam. And I realized that I could have stopped sharing my screen, but I didn't, but that's okay. Let's quickly just look at this rubric. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. Again, this comes from the IEB SACS document. I think it's a lovely rubric to use as guidance. Again, they've got 7 levels, 7 being the highest, total of 10 marks, and then the description of a person that would score in that bracket. Good. And then when it gets to your caps, it's just important to realize that your rubric, there are marks that are allocated to your scales and your arpeggios, but then something that's came in later is to do a technical study as well. Good. So I'm going to just quickly stop sharing my screen there. So let's have a look at the last component today, or of today's video, and that is how to assess oral. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. And just want to quickly get to the right one that I want to share. Okay, there you go. So let's quickly look at the difference once again between CAPS and IEB. So for the matric final exam, learners are required to be able to do some sight singing, clapping a rhythm, and then singing triads or chords. I have to admit, I think this is a bit unfair, because if you're not a singer, it means you're going to be penalized there as well as there. But then nonetheless, that is in the syllabus. So personally, I do like the IEB syllabus more when it gets to oral, because learners have to identify the tonalities in chords and scales. They need to clap back a 2-bar rhythm. Then there's sight singing, but it's only 2 marks. So all of this, each time, it's just 2 marks. And you'll see sight singing in CAPS is, I think, it's 8 marks out of 15. So that's quite a lot. So I think the balance is just better here. And then the learners need to be able to identify cadences and metrical pulse. Okay, in other words, the time signature. Good. So how are we going to go about assessing these things? And I'm going to let's just quickly talk about IEB, because I want to go into more. No, let's start with CAPS. So here is a sample of the oral assessment that you'll find in a final grade 12 exam. Okay, so like I said, the sight singing counts 8 marks. So how are we going to mark this? So learners are required to be able to sing this. They're welcome to also do it a bit higher or lower. So adjust do if necessary. So there are 2 things that they need to be able to do here. They need to be able to sing the pitches, and then it's also the rhythm. So I would suggest, since it's 8 marks, to mark one bar at a time. So half a mark pitch, half a mark rhythm, half a mark pitch, half a mark rhythm. That I think that would be the easiest way to do it. You can also just mark overall, because maybe you feel they didn't, you know, it was just slight rhythmic hesitations that they had. It wasn't really distracting that much. Then I would say, well, just penalize them with half a mark, or maybe 1 mark if needs be. So you also need to think of it overall, you know, the overall impression. So say you started off by marking 1 bar at a time, but then in the end you thought, you know what, I was actually a bit too strict or too lenient, and then you can adjust the mark. Good. So let's quickly look at the second component, and that's the ability to actually clap a rhythm. So yes, it needs to be correct. Okay. And you need to decide to which degree was it correct. It's only 5 marks. So you need to think, okay, so the learner made a mistake here. So this is now, you know, 4 bars. Which makes it a bit difficult now to convert it to the 5. So I wouldn't go 1 bar at a time. Or you can say, well, up to there, that's half of it. How much of that was accurate? Would you put it in the category, you know, 4 to 5? So in other words, 80 to 100%. Was it more like a 70, a 60, 50, below that? So you can do that, split it there, and then you look at that part. Or I would not do it like that personally. I would just, listen to the whole rhythm, and then I would just trust my gut. I always trust my gut. Your gut is such a wonderful thing. And normally it's that gut feel that's right. And you would be surprised, especially if you are new at assessment. You would be surprised at, you know, if you trust your gut and you compare your marks with that of other examiners afterwards, how accurate you were. Good. And then the last component there for CAPS is singing of a triad, and it's either right or wrong. Okay, so you can't award half marks. It's either major or it's a minor. You can't, yes, it's either right or wrong. Good. And then let's quickly have a look at the IEB rubric. So I'm not going to look at the various components. Like I said, it's 2 marks per item. So if there are 2 cadences, they get the 1 right and the other 1 wrong. It's 1 out of 2. Okay, so IEB is actually quite straightforward to mark. Now let's quickly just wrap this up by looking at the IEB's rubric. Again, you know that I like it. So your 7 levels, and then they, you know, in the end, so although you mark the various elements independently, you also need to then think overall, you know, what was the standard of the the performance, the section. I lost my focus there for a moment. What was the overall standard of the oral component? Okay, so if you look at your level 7, there were no errors of substance. Okay, minor blemishes of detail, convincing rhythmic sense, accurate intonation and pitch, correctly identifies all cadences, and then there's a prompt and intuitive response to everything. What I have to say, I mean, if you work with this overall, it is a bit difficult. I like the idea more of, you know, splitting it up into the various categories, and then you tally the marks from there. Because, for example, here, they, what would you do if all of this applies, but the cadences were wrong? So, I think although you've got this rubric, I would suggest looking at the various independent aspects, assess that, and then you place it into these categories. And again, I'm so sorry I stopped to share my screen, but at least I can just close this with the full screen of myself. Thank you for watching. I really hope that this will help you to assess these 3 elements. And remember, if you struggle, don't be scared to ask more experienced examiners. I'm sure they will be more than happy to assist you.